Welcome to our circular sock knitting machine channel. This lesson is using 3 wedges to shape a heel. These wedges, when they're made of the same yarn and same color as the rest of the sock, are nearly invisible. When you get a close-up view here, you can see the direction that the line of knitting is going. If you try to follow a line of knitting around, you can see where that curve is. The same, I want you to compare the shaping of a regular, what we would call a mitered heel, where the stitch line comes over and abruptly stops and goes the other direction. So it comes here and it almost makes a 90-degree angle and goes that way. And you have a continuous single line of, in short rowing, a heel. Possibly using the term short rowing can be confusing when you're first getting started. Decreased shaping and increased shaping actually relates more to what's going on. So when you decrease shaping, you're reducing the number of stitches that you're working. When you reduce a stitch, you're also reducing a needle. So oftentimes when we crank instead of hand knit, we're referencing what we're doing with needles. We're raising needles to put them out of work, which then means the stitch isn't getting knit. So we're reducing stitches. But we actually only talk about lifting a needle. So as you put a needle out, you're putting a stitch out. So you're decreasing your stitches as you work your way out. And then you're increasing your stitches as you work your way back in, and you do it one at a time. When you do a wedge, you're only going to work 2 needles on each side the traditional way, where you crank around, you lift a needle out of work. You've decreased by 1 needle. Decrease in the number of stitches, but you've also done an automatic wrap. Lift that needle, come back around, lift the next needle. The last one worked. And then you come back around again, you lift the next one. Okay, so now you've got 2 on each side. Stop. And now we're not going to continue to work 1 needle at a time. We're going to lift all of the needles out to the same heel mark that you normally would use, all the way out to the heel mark, lift all those needles up. So you don't decrease them one at a time, you decrease them all at the same time. And then when you increase them back, you're increasing 3 at a time, and then you lift the last one out of work for an automatic wrap. So it's put 3 down, crank, lift 1 up, the last needle worked. And then you do the other side, put 3 down, lift the last needle worked. And then you come back to this side, put 3 down, lift the last needle worked. And if you think about it, when you do the wedge and you get back to that apex needle, you're going to go 2 rows to come back up. And now you'll be on your second wedge. And you do it exactly the same as you did the first wedge. Each wedge is done exactly the same. Where this idea came from is Kat Brody's Sweet Tomato Heel. Her directions were for hand knitting. In order to prevent a problem here at the apex, she solved that in a very ingenious way for a hand knitter. She would make 2 full revolutions around the sock. Now in hand knitting, that's an easy thing to do on a hand knitting needle. It's not so easy to do. You can do it, but it requires a great deal of effort to be sure you don't end up with a drop stitch. And when you look at the results of just working that 2 rows, in the heel and not in the rest of the sock, there's no difference. For that reason, I omitted the idea of cranking around in a circle. Now, what happens here in the corner? Well, if you've got the 3 colors going, you have to wrap in between. When you're going from, when you finished 1 wedge and you're starting the second wedge, and you're back down here, you need to wrap that apex needle that's behind the half mark. And when you're finished with that second wedge, and you're starting with the 3rd color, you have to wrap that same apex needle behind the half mark before you go forward and finish that 3rd wedge. The other option is to just pick it up. You'll have a salvage edge. If you just pick that stitch up and set it on the apex needle, then it serves the same purpose as wrapping it twice. And in some ways, probably easier to remember. So again, we're doing a lesson and a demonstration on a 3-wedge heel. We're going to get started with all of our needles with half of out and our yarn in a take-up wire. We need to come from the right, on my right side over to my left side. 1/2 row, but it's considered 1 full row for a heel. So now I'm going to either wrap, or I could have knit that and then lifted it. It's your choice, but it's the needle behind the half mark on the side where you begin and end your heel. You do this on both sides. Now as we crank around over back to the, we're going to lift the last needle knit. We do this after every row. There are no exceptions. We'll crank back the other way and we'll lift the last needle work again. Now we're going to begin the actual shaping of the wedge. And because we're on the opposite side with our yarn, we're coming over to lift the needles out of work. And it's going to be from the needles that we had already knit, which were 2. Now we go all the way over to the side, to the heel mark. Crank over to that. Now we're going to lift the last needle worked again. So it'll be over to your heel mark plus 1 needle. We're going back over to the other side to lift the other needles over to the heel mark. And we'll do the same process that we did on the left by cranking over and lifting that last needle worked. Now before we start shaping our wedge, we need to get some weight on the front so that we will have completed stitches and no drop stitches. We're going to use our little handy dandy cable cuff from Home Depot. Very cheap little item, works great with our circular sock machines. I'm going to cinch it up underneath around my tube, and I'm going to click it together and push it up toward my knitting as far as I can get it, right there. Now I'm going to take a 2-pound weight so that it doesn't stick up quite so high and you can see better what I'm doing, see past it. And when I'm trying to get the beads to the front, that's where the action's happening, that's where the weight needs to be. So now we're going to get started and shaping our wedge with 3 needles down right away, right off, 3 needles in a row. And now we lift the last needle worked. Always lift the last needle worked. Now we'll put 3 needles down on the other side. And again, lift that last needle worked. That's doing an automatic wrap. Now we're going back, 3 needles down, tucking in, making sure the knitting's staying down, raise that last needle, 3 needles down again. This goes very quickly. Shaping each wedge does go very quickly. 3 needles down, crank across, lift the last needle work. So that is your rhythm. It's 3 needles down, crank across, and lift that last needle worked. And this is all there is to doing the wedge. It's the same motion, but actually far fewer times than if you were cranking normally. And if you notice, you got to lift all your needles all the way over to the heel mark, and you didn't have to do the individual needle decrease, which usually is the reason it's frustrating for beginners in shaping a heel or a toe. Look, we're done. We're done with our first wedge. So there's my second row, and I have 2 needles on the left and I have 2 needles on the right, and I'm ready to lift all the rest of the needles over to the heel mark to start shaping my second wedge. And now I'm going to lift that last needle worked, and I'll start lifting the needles over on the left-hand side of my left-hand side. And I'll crank back across. I'll lift the last needle worked. And now I'll put down 3 needles over there on the right-hand side, my right-hand side, and crank across. And so we're back into this rhythm again of cranking across, lifting the last needle worked, and putting 3 needles down. And you do that until you get back to the half mark. Now I want to comment that depending on if you have an even number of needles or an odd number of needles, you are going to end up with either 3 or 2 needles at the end. It doesn't matter. Just when you get to the end, if you've only got 2 needles, then go ahead and work those 2 needles instead of thinking you have to have 3 and go behind the half mark. You don't want to go behind the half mark. Now I'm working with the idea of the weight. And weight is a really critical thing when you're doing your wedges. You need pushing down, pushing down. And to get the pushing down right, soft weights work about the best. It's also a difficult issue about soft weights versus hanging weights, whether you're using 1 or you're using 4. But if you use the soft weight and your hand, your weight's right there, and you can see when you need to press down, add a little to your soft weight beside your hand. Also, it helps use a 3.5 pound instead of the 2 pound. Now look, we've got our wedges, and you can see that they're thicker in the middle and narrower on the ends, and so it's giving us that beautiful curve. It looks a little bit like a beach ball when you're done. So we're clipping our yellow, and we're getting ready to do our third wedge in turquoise. So now we're bringing our turquoise in, and we're going to start our third wedge. We'll crank 2 rows. See, I'm tucking the ends in, but I'm also actually pushing the fabric of the wedges down in there so that I can get the weight to really be pressing on the wedges instead of the needles on the back side, or pushing straight down into the tube. So there we have the weight sitting really close there up front, and it gives us what we needed. So we're cranking our first row of turquoise, lifting the last needle worked, which is now 2 needles are up on the right hand side. Now we lift the last needle work. We have 2 rows of turquoise. And we're going to show one more time how to set up to begin your wedge by lifting all the needles on the far side, on the right side, all the way to the heel mark. And at this point, we need to do the very last needle down on the turquoise so that we'll have enough time to be able to show you the end with all the wedges. Now there's our wedges, red, yellow, and turquoise. Very nice. Okay. 3 Wedge Heel is a Circular Sock Knitting Machine Society member video. To learn more about the Circular Sock Machine channel and available videos, read about us in the CSKM Circular News.